Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual edition of Geopolitics with Ron Granieri. We have a great evening this evening. We have Lorenzo Medina, who's an expert on jihadi networks and has just written a book on the Muslim Brotherhood. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ron Granieri, our host for tonight. Thank you for coming, and as always, we appreciate your support for FPRI. Thank you.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is Tuesday night in Philadelphia, and the world is as complicated as ever. In fact, it's probably more complicated than usual. So let's talk about it. Welcome to this special April 2020 online edition of Geopolitics with Granieri, FPRI's monthly discussion of international affairs. I am indeed, as our president just announced, Ron Granieri, the chairman of FPRI's the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America in the West, and your host and moderator of today's discussion. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us here on Zoom in our new live function, as well as recorded if you're listening to this recording. We are delighted to have you with us. If you are on the live recording with us, please note that you can send us questions at any time using your chat function on Zoom. If you have any technical problems, please chat at Eli Gilman, our omnicompetent moderator, who is available through Foreign Policy Research Institute among the participants in this discussion. So the Muslim Brotherhood is a paradox. It's an organization whose members prefer to deny it exists, even as it has successfully organized national and international networks, including political parties that have ruled in Turkey and, for a time at least, in Egypt. The subject of intense fascination for both Islamists and those who fear their influence in government and out, the Brotherhood exercises a powerful hold on the imagination as it lurks somewhere in the political shadows. Those in the Brotherhood rarely discuss their work openly. Those who have left only have recently begun to lift the curtain. Our guest tonight, Lorenzo Medina, is one of the leading experts on the Brotherhood. He has just published The Closed Circle: Joining and Leaving the Muslim Brotherhood in the West, based on interviews with former members to help us understand the reasons that Muslims join the Brotherhood and the reasons why they leave, as well as to get a sense of the organization's structure and goals. So how does the Muslim Brotherhood operate in the West? Who joins? Or more pointedly, who leaves? How should the West deal with the Brotherhood, and what are its long-term goals? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation with our guest, Lorenzo Medina. Lorenzo Medina is the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. An expert on Islamism in Europe and North America, his research over the past 20 years has focused on the mobilization dynamics of jihadist networks in the West and the activities of Muslim Brotherhood-inspired organizations. Dr. Vidino earned a law degree from the University of Milan and a doctorate in international relations from Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He has held positions at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and at the Kennedy School of Government, the U.S. Institute of Peace, the RAND Corporation, and the Center for Security Studies, ETH Zurich. The author of several books and numerous articles, Dr. Vidino's most prominent work before The Closed Circle is The New Muslim Brotherhood in the West, published in 2010 by Columbia University Press. The leading scholar on the Muslim Brotherhood in the West, we are delighted to have him with us tonight. Welcome, Lorenzo Medina.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ron.
You bet. So, Lorenzo, I want to start out with a basic question. How did you become interested in the Brotherhood? And how does your work on the Brotherhood fit within the larger scholarly work on the subject?
I became interested 20 years ago, right after 9/11, pretty much. I grew up, you might pick up on a certain accent here, which I think we have common roots. I grew up in Milan, Italy. And Milan was, and still is, a place where there's a very prominent jihadist mosque, which used to be the hub from which foreign fighters from all over the Arab world transited to go to fight in Bosnia in the 90s. Got very interested. That was my neighborhood. I grew up there. So young journalist, semi-scholar, started looking into it. And if you peel the onion a bit, just you lift one veil there, you found that, yes, there were jihadists with long beards and big weapons running the mosque, but the people owning the deeds of the mosque were gentlemen in suit and tie who sat on board of banks in the Bahamas, who ran companies from Georgia to Liechtenstein, completely different breed, but also Islamists.
Mm-hmm.
And these were prominent members of the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt originally, who had set up shop between Italy and Switzerland. So I started being very interested in this dynamic where, yes, there was the obvious side, the jihadists, we're talking about in an immediate post 9/11 environment, the violent component was the big one, but what was the relationship between the violent ones and the seemingly non-violent ones? So that's how I got started. And to some degree, I would say that I kind of feel a bit of a niche there in terms of scholarship, meaning you said the leading scholar. I would say in a less flattering way, the only scholar that looks at the Brotherhood in the West.
Well, my wife is an only child, and her father likes to say that she's his favorite daughter. So these things.
There you go. I had a similarly unflattering way. So in 2014, I was retained by the British government when Cameron set up the review of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a big effort, and you might want to talk about it later. The British government tried to look at the Muslim Brotherhood, both in the UK and in the Arab world, as a whole of government exercise, sort of like a 9/11 commission. And I was retained, and so I had my first meeting at the cabinet, very, very excited, and I said, "Look, this is great, but I'm not British, never lived in the UK. Why is that?" And the very unflattering answer was, if we wanted an expert on Brotherhood in Egypt, there's 50. We want an expert on Brotherhood in Jordan, 20. Brotherhood in Syria, 20. Brotherhood in the West, there's you and a couple of crazy bloggers. So that's it.
Well, and neither of those crazy bloggers was available tonight, so we were glad we were able to get you here with us, Lorenzo.
Appreciate it.
But I do want to ask you, for our audience more generally, how should we understand the Brotherhood as a political force in the Arab world versus its role in the West? How different is it?
It's quite different.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should understand exactly what we mean by Brotherhood in the West.
Sure. Yes.
It's a very complex story, of course, and I can only really summarize it in a few seconds. Basically, starting in the 1950s and 60s, we had some pioneers, let's say, of the Muslim Brotherhood, members of the Brotherhood in Egypt, in Syria, in a variety of Arab countries who fled the persecutions in those countries and came to the West. There were also students that came, and actually Philadelphia was a big hub, some university in the Philly area, where from the get-go, from the 1960s, hubs for students who were members of the upper middle class of the Arab world came to the West and set up what were some of the very first clusters of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is not what some of those conspiratorial bloggers would make you believe, some kind of giant plan of the Muslim Brotherhood to Islamize the West. It just happened. Just fortuitous life trajectories of some of these individuals. Now, of course, once they came to the West, some of these individuals created these networks, and probably in their mind in the 50s and 60s, the idea was to go back, go back to the countries of origin and continue what they were doing. For some of them, it did happen. For some, it didn't. They stayed in the West, and those tiny organizations, mostly student groupings that they created in the 50s and 60s, evolved over time and became large organizations in a very typical Muslim Brotherhood fashion, with different sub-organizations working on finances, on student organizations, on charitable work, on a variety of activities that serve the larger purpose of the organization. And of course, this time, the Brotherhood, being a very flexible, very smart, very pragmatic organization, understood that the goal in the West is not to turn Germany, Spain, or the US into an Islamic state. That might be that lofty goal 2 or 3 centuries down the road, but it's really something that the Brotherhood doesn't work on a daily basis. What it works on is basically to become sort of the leaders of Muslim communities in the West, exert an influence on them, bring Muslims in the West to their interpretation, their socio-political and religious interpretation of worldview, and to influence public policy, when it comes to domestic and foreign policy.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because when we think about the Brotherhood in in the lands where it was born, in Egypt, in Syria. The Brotherhood is born around the same time, ironically, I guess, as Baathism, as a form of secular nationalism. You have the Brotherhood emerges as an Islamist political movement. And so you say the goal is not, in the West at least, is not to Islamize the West, but is it fair to say that their goal in their homelands is to Islamize their homelands? I mean, is this that they would like to see more theocratic, might be a little too extreme, but they would like to see a much more explicitly Muslim governments. And yet, from an outsider perspective, right, we look at some of these states and we see that many of them do have very powerful sort of Islamic expression. And yet, so does the Brotherhood see this as a triumph of their influence, or are they see themselves as representing a different form of Islamism that exists politically in the states of the region? Because I think the irony that I'm thinking of here is that the Brotherhood is so much a part of the politics of Egypt, but it is not is it a part of the politics in the Gulf, for example, in places where you can have very heavily religious institutions, but not ones that are connected to the Brotherhood?
Yeah. Very complex question.
It is a complex question. I apologize.
Every country really has a different story, different trajectory. The goal of the Brotherhood is, of course, that of gradually, and gradualism is the name of the game, Islamizing society, starting from the core unit, the Islamic individual, the Islamic family, all the way up to creating an Islamic society and eventually Islamic regime. That is done through a combination of tactics that range from grassroots activism, proselytism, and participation in politics. Basically, to the degree that participation is allowed by the individual regimes. Of course, in some countries, there's a certain degree of a certain room for them. I mean, the Brotherhood is in government in Morocco, is tolerated and works with the king in Jordan, is illegal in a variety of other countries. So it takes different forms. Again, flexibility, the name of the game, depending on the country. But the goal is always that one. It's to work within the system to the extent it is allowed to Islamize society, but of course to itself retain a high degree of power. It's not sort of an uninterested Islamization. It's always seen them as the leading force in that Islamization of society.
Well, and this gets to an interesting point that you bring up, especially when we talk about the Brotherhood in the West, is the Brotherhood wants to present itself and does present itself as harmless, and yet it also tries to keep its membership and its active role secret. Right. So the idea is the Brotherhood says, our goal is not they don't want to appear to be threatening, but they also have a long tradition of being clandestine as an organization. And all I keep thinking of is it possible for an organization to be both secretive and non-dangerous at the same time?
It's a big debate inside the Brotherhood in the West on that. So you were mentioning my book. It's based on interviews with some 15 individuals who left the Brotherhood. And of course, each of them left for different reasons. It's a personal trajectory, very complex for each of them. But for most of them, that secrecy was one of the reasons that initially was intriguing. You're joining something that is secretive, that works for Islam, but eventually was something that turned them off and led them to disengage and leave the organization. And the idea is this: it's understandable for the Brotherhood to operate in secrecy in countries like Egypt, like Syria, where that's the only reason why they've been able to withstand the repression from those regimes for decades and survive. But in the West, it's a different story. And that's some of the internal conversations which are happening for the most part very quietly, very discreetly. And these former members for interviews are some of the very few people who bring these debates out in the open, say, why do we need to be so secretive in 2020 in Frankfurt, in Cleveland, in Barcelona? That makes no sense. Of course, saying we are the Muslim Brotherhood would lead to some criticism, to some challenges from people like myself, from other people. But still, if we believe we're doing something right, there is no point in maintaining the secrecy that we have in the East here in the West. So that secrecy, of course, within the Brotherhood leads to lack of internal democracy. The leadership, it's one of the reasons why a lot of people leave the Brotherhood. It's because it lacks that internal transparency. And of course, it's always justified by the leadership as well. We have to keep everything secret. You're not supposed to know everything because then we're going to be infiltrated. But again, that might make sense in Syria. It might make sense in some other countries in the Middle East. It doesn't make sense in Sweden or in Canada. So I think the very first problem that I think a lot of people have with the Brotherhood is the fact that a lot of these organizations, I mean, let me make it clear for everybody who is listening, there's not a single organization in Europe or in North America that openly calls itself Muslim Brotherhood. They would always have some other kind of name where everybody knows that all or the majority of individuals behind them are members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in a way, that's where the deception starts. It's like if I introduce myself today with a different name and from a different organization, how would you take seriously anything that I say? And that's the criticism that starts within the Brotherhood. We should shed that secrecy in the West today.
Because goodness knows that's a big part of the way the Brotherhood is spoken about, is when it is revealed that a particular journal or a particular charity or a particular organization is connected to the Brotherhood. That creates a mini scandal or perhaps even a larger scandal. It becomes and I would imagine that would actually undermine the effectiveness of the organization or the effectiveness of the Brotherhood to be, if they keep it secret and it waits for somebody else to expose it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not, at the end of the day, it's also on their part, not a very smart game. Yeah. And you do see a very big division within the Brotherhood. Most of the people who want to retain this secrecy are the old guard, the people who came to the West from the East, and of course have retained that sort of mindset, that deep-seated fear of revealing themselves, which is to some degree understandable. But after 40, 50, 60 years of presence in the West, that should change. And I think that's another big problem. That's for the new generations. A lot of the people who are at this point running a lot of these organizations tend to be second, not third generation, born and raised in the West. And some, not all, but some of these individuals want to have more openness. So I think in 10 years, we might have a different conversation. A lot of these organizations are going in different routes. It's not always easy for the core Brotherhood people to fully control these organizations, but the acknowledging the ideological legacy, the historical and organizational and financial linkages that exist should be. If these organizations really want to be part of a conversation, really want to be having a seat at the tables that matter, representing Muslim communities, as they claim to do, the first thing, it should be honesty. It should be admitting a certain history and then moving forward. It's not a crime to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in any Western country. I know there's occasionally debate, also the United States in particular, about designating the organization. I always have the sense that it goes nowhere. It's not my personal take. But the conversation should be more open from their point of view in the first place.
Well, when you talk about divisions within the Brotherhood, the generational one is fascinating, but there's also something you bring up in your book that while the Brotherhood in the West interacts with very diverse Muslim communities, the organization itself is still very heavily dominated by Arabs, and especially by people, as you say, who come from those first places where members of the Brotherhood fled to the West from. And that there are tensions within the Brotherhood between different ethnic and national communities within Islam, that people feel as though they are excluded from leadership in the Brotherhood if they're from Somalia, if they're from, or even if they're converts in the West. And how does the Brotherhood deal with this tension, which one could argue is a problem with Islamism? Is it a movement of Islam, which is a universal religion, or is it a movement of Arab politics, which therefore leaves the decision making in the hands of Arabs?
Yeah, you capture one of the big dynamics that lead to discontent within the organization. In the Arab world, these organizations are ethnically homogeneous. The Egyptian Brotherhood will have only Egyptians. Now, in a Western setting, let's say the Brotherhood in the United States will have in the same city members from Egypt, from Sub-Saharan Africa, converts, South Asians. So all this sense of brotherhood in Islam, which the Brotherhood talks about, when push comes to shove, doesn't really translate in actual facts. And you do see dynamics in which, particularly the founders of the group from Egypt or from the Levant, have somewhat, I think it's fair to call it racist views and racist attitudes towards individuals who are not from the same geographical area. The only individual that I interviewed from the US was a convert, African-American convert, who went through the whole trajectory that many African-Americans had, sort of protest conversion in the 70s, Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, then traditional Sunnism, and he was somewhat co-opted by Brotherhood networks. And he at some point realized he was being sort of sidelined within Brotherhood milieux, despite doing a lot of good things, attracting a lot of people, and until he found a document, which was published in an internal publication, that said that the value for the Brotherhood of a white convert was 10 times the value of an African-American convert, because it was written, printed out in an internal publication, which I have. Because the goal of the Brotherhood should be that of influencing American society, and therefore having Caucasian converts with much more value than African-American converts. Now you can imagine this individual's reaction after experiencing racism inside, sensing it, and then seeing it on paper. That is probably one of the most dramatic examples I could give you, but it's a very common pattern. In Italy, for example, the vast majority of Muslims come from North Africa, Moroccans, Tunisians, and so on. The leadership of Brotherhood organizations, so those that claim to speak for Islam in Italy, are basically from either Palestinian or Jordanians or Syrians, basically. Because those are the very first students that came in the 70s, but there's no population from the Levant in Italy, but they retain sort of the reins of power, creating this, again, lack of internal democracy, lack of meritocracy, and very murky internal dynamics that lead to disenchantment that lead people to.
I mean, it is interesting to the whole question about people leaving an organization or joining an organization like the Brotherhood and leaving it. For somebody who's not a specialist in the Middle East, the example that I had in mind when I was reading your book was the literature that comes out in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s about people who join and leave the Communist Party. Right, there's a famous collection of essays, "The God That Failed," edited by Richard Crossman. Right, and actually Richard Wright, the African-American author, his whole discussion is here, he joins the Communist Party because he thinks as an African-American, he wants there to be revolutionary change. And then he joins the party and he finds out that the communists are racists too. And this is profoundly disappointing for him, profoundly disillusioning. But it raises that issue of how should an international organization, when it has its roots in a particular region or a particular culture, how should it present itself? And to tighten up this question a little bit, because you mentioned the idea of this document, which you had cited in your book too, about the value of Caucasian converts, is are there prominent converts in the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West?
A handful.
A handful.
Very small number.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's difficult in a group like the Brotherhood to really fully understand who calls the shots.
Mm-hmm.
There is a tendency to, particularly in some of these organizations, to put in the front certain individuals who know certain dynamics, know how to interact with the outside world better, but they're not really the most powerful ones. So visibility is not a synonym of power within the Brotherhood. One of the individuals I profiled was very interesting. A Swedish former member of the Brotherhood, and he looks very Swedish. His father is Pakistani, but his mother is Swedish, but he's blonde, blue-eyed, and he grew up with his mother, so speaks Swedish fluently. And in the 90s, within those networks and within a very new Swedish Muslim community, that was a big asset. So he was the guy who was president of all the organizations. He would be the one who would be meeting all the ministers, do all the official work for this organization, but he had no power inside. He says, I was only just the pretty blonde, blue-eyed face. and the reassuring face of this of the network. But inside, they treated me, you know, like I wasn't really that important. So it's difficult to say, but I would say that we're still in a phase where most of the organizations are controlled by sort of an old guard. There's one fairly easy explanation as to why the old guard manages to retain the control, is because they have access to funding. They are the ones who have the best connections in some Middle Eastern countries, the Gulf, Turkey these days, and they are the ones who can get funding. The younger ones, if they move away from the structures, they are less likely to be able to raise the amounts of money that the old guard can. So it really goes down to that. So a lot of these people leave the Brotherhood, try to set up new organizations. They might attract a lot of sympathy, but it's a matter of resource and who controls them.
Because Brotherhood members, they essentially do some version of tithing to the organization, right? That if you're a member, you turn over a portion, whatever, an agreed upon portion of your income to the organization, right?
Yeah, it's between 2 and 5%, but that's really not where the money for the organization comes from. It comes from a variety of sources, from some of the businesses they run, some of the charities they run, community donations, Western countries in some cases, you know, through a variety of projects that they fund. But at the end of the day, the bulk of the funding comes from private and public donors in the Middle East. And that's really what sets them apart from every other Muslim organization, is the largesse of the donations that have come over the last 50 years from the Middle East. And
how do we account for the willingness? Is there a profile of the major donors to the Brotherhood? Who, you know, we don't know who they are specifically, but as far as, you know, where do these big money people come from? You know, what I think is, you know, when we think of the influence of, say, the Saudi royal family and other forms of raising money for charities, right? Obviously, they're not giving money to the Brotherhood. So, but who is giving money to the Brotherhood?
Yeah, it's not easy, of course.
Of course, right.
Although I think the last few years we've seen a lot of very interesting investigations being done on that. Mm-hmm. Geopolitics have changed a lot when it comes to that. I think if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, when I came to FPRI to present my first book and I gave a Templeton lecture 10 years ago, my answer would have been different. It would have been pretty much everybody in the Gulf. Mm-hmm. And that meant private individuals, and that meant a lot of the large charities, the governmental charities, which at the end of the day are public and governments. Now, with the Arab Spring and the big changes that came in a lot of countries in terms of their attitude towards the Brotherhood, several governments, starting with Saudi and the UAE, have stopped giving money to the Brotherhood. Now, of course, you cannot rule out that specific individuals within the Gulf, within those countries, do still give money to some organizations. But the Brotherhood has been designated a terrorist organization in those two countries. I mean, in those,
specifically the Saudis and the UAE? Oh, interesting.
Yeah, both of them. So the two big countries that at this point fund the Brotherhood are Qatar and Turkey. Mm-hmm. And those two, Turkey has stepped in, I would say, the same way Saudi Arabia has funded all this in the 70s and 80s. Today, that role has been taken over by Turkey, and Qatar has also funded very generously. As I said, there's also private individuals. I mean, the dynamics that have been described, for example, is sort of Western-based Brotherhood activists lurking in the lobbies of fancy hotels in London or Paris or Geneva and spotting wealthy individuals from the Gulf, inviting them to the mosque. You know, the dynamics of very wealthy individuals spending a month in London, a month in Geneva, praying this mosque, and then at the end of their vacation there, giving them a little donation of, let's say, $50,000, $100,000, which all of us normally
just a little something, just something for the collection plate.
Exactly.
Well, and you mentioned Turkey, and I want to bring up Turkey in particular here too, because of the connection between AKP, the ruling the governing party in Turkey, and the Brotherhood. Right? They're not identical, but they are related. And does President Erdogan, does his Law and Justice Party, do they see themselves, Justice Development Party, do they see themselves as patrons of the Brotherhood because they feel as though the Brotherhood is their thing? And if that's so, how does this fit in with the other sort of the Arab dominance of the Brotherhood, if the most successful Brotherhood political movement is actually Turkish?
Yeah, the AKP has basically been a fellow traveler, I mean the party, but basically which represents a strand of Turkish Islamism that has been a fellow traveler of the Brotherhood. Same approach, very similar ideology. Of course, there's a strong Turkish, Ottoman, nationalist twist to it, but when it comes to the core ideology, the core worldview, the methodology, it's very much similar. And the historical links date back. There's a story that I tell in the book about how one of the main individuals I profiled was really one of the individuals who set up many of the Brotherhood organizations in the West, worked with Erdogan in the 70s. So it was a very young, promising student. So the ties go back a long time. Now, of course, Turkish Islamism has its history and work within a certain society and a certain political system, and its very strong challenges in the 70s and 80s. But over the last 20 years has been the successful model that all other Brotherhood entities try to imitate. And over the last 10, 15 years, but definitely the last 10 years, Erdogan and the AKP have been the patrons. I think you used the perfect word that captures that, of the Brotherhood, whether that means of Brotherhood members in Arab countries. If today you want to talk to most of the leaders of the Egyptian Brotherhood, those that are not in prison in Egypt are hanging out within Ankara and Istanbul. But they're also the patrons of Brotherhood networks in the West. Turkey, and Erdogan in particular, sees itself as, or tries to project this image of the protector of Muslims in the West. You see some tensions that periodically come up between individual, mostly European governments and Erdogan for the funding that comes from Turkey, from the rhetoric that comes from Turkey, and Turkish Islamist networks in Europe, but also in the United States, work hand in hand with Brotherhood networks. I think in some cases you see a lot of these organizations now that have Turkish Islamists on the board, something you would not have seen 10 years ago. It's very much a marriage of convenience, but it's also something that is glued by a common ideology.
Well, and as I encourage the audience to please send in their questions with the chat, I'm going to ask you one more, branching off of what you were just discussing, is what is the connection between the Gülenist movement in Turkey and the Brotherhood? Is there one? Not much at all, right?
Not much at all, especially now, because
especially
this
now.
marriage of between Brotherhood and the AKP, being a friend of Gülen would not be very conducive to getting AKP support.
Indeed.
I mean, in the past, some minor, but definitely nowadays, it's definitely a group that the Brotherhood would keep at arm's length.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in your book, you talk about, right, it's about the Brotherhood in the West and about joining and leaving. When we talk about the West, right, as the director of the Center for the Study of America in the West, right, one of the questions that interests us is what does the West mean? In other words, how different is the experience of the Brotherhood in Europe versus in the United States within the West?
It's not that different. I would say pretty much to say every country, of course, we can get into peculiarities, and the Brotherhood has this ability to understand the environment. Unlike some other Islamist groups, it really has an ability, and it's not perfect, of course, it makes mistakes, but to understand what are the tactical alliances to strike, what are the moves to make, very acute ability to understand the environment. But give or take, the tactics are more or less the same. What I would say is the big difference, I'm going to be a bit provocative here, but the big difference here is, particularly the last 10 years, is the different attitude of government towards the Brotherhood. there's pretty much a consensus in Europe that the Brotherhood is a highly problematic organization. It's not a terrorist organization. There's hardly any debate here, I'm in Europe right now, here in Europe about designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. But there is a lot of concern in terms of the impact that the Brotherhood has on integration, on social cohesion, on polarization. Those are sort of the key words that are used among policymakers in Europe when they express concerns about the Brotherhood. In the States, the debate is only security, or for the most part, I would say security-based. There's some debate about designating as a terrorist organization. As I said, I'm a bit skeptical about that approach for a variety of reasons. There's very little concern about the social impact of the organization. It seems to me that it lacks a bit, it's seen in a very black or white way, where you're either a terrorist organization and therefore bad and they need to be designated, or not a problem. We shouldn't be looking into that. Where I think a healthier approach and fully understanding that there's more tolerance in America for groups that advocate sort of a separation, sort of a self-isolation, things like tolerating the KKK, marching through a Jewish neighborhood is something that would be inconceivable in Europe, but fully understanding that it's acceptable in America. Having said that, what I think is a bit my concern is that there's not a bit nuanced debate that, simplifying things a bit, exists in Europe in terms of looking at a group that operates, for the most part, 99% within the law, yet it's problematic. The Germans take a very sound approach, which the German authorities, German security services, have two groups of organization they monitor: terrorist groups and extremist groups. And they call the Brotherhood a legalist Islamist organization, an organization that operates within the law, doesn't break it, not occasionally, but nonetheless should be monitored because problematic from a variety of points of view. And that's not something that really exists in the US.
I see. Well, this is good. The your comments have sparked a flood of questions from the audience, and so I want to go through some of them. One of them is from Jeremy, who asks, "How does the Muslim Brotherhood fit, if at all, into the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia?" In other words, how does the Brotherhood see itself in, or even in the larger split, I would say, between Sunni and Shia? Does the Brotherhood take sides, or is the Brotherhood a largely Sunni organization? So
it is Sunni. It is 100%.
It's 100% Sunni organization.
100% Sunni.
Yeah.
Historically, kind of had different approaches when it comes to the sectarian divide. 1979. I mean, there's always been that kind of. I would call it. I think it's not unfair to call it a Sunni supremacist movement. Of course, it sees Shias as inferior. You occasionally see some clerics linked to the Brotherhood saying the Shias are not really Muslims and that kind of approach. But there's the occasional flirtation. 1979, it's inspiring. What happens in Iran, if the Shias did it, we should be able to do it. That's sort of the approach within the Brotherhood. 2006, Hezbollah gives a bit of a headache to Israel. Big overture toward Hezbollah. So there are these moments, but generally speaking, there's not a lot of friendship towards Shia groups. And of course, Saudi Arabia historically had used the Brotherhood as an anti-Iran, anti-Shia movement in a more geopolitical way. Now, with the strong antipathy that exists between Saudi and the Brotherhood, nowadays most Brotherhood members would see Saudi as the big enemy more than Iran. So there's the occasional pro-Iran sympathy, mostly in an anti-Saudi fashion.
Interesting. Well, then back to the American perspective, right? We have a question here from Ben, who asks, what engagement, if any, is there between the Brotherhood and the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is the most visible Islamic organization, political advocacy organization in the U.S.? Is it open, concealed, non-existent? What are the connections with the Brotherhood?
There's a strong historical link. I mean, CARE would be one of the groups that I would say has an undeniable historical linkage to the Brotherhood. There's one of the largest terrorism financing case in U.S. history, the Holy Land Foundation case, disclosed documents including those wiretaps from a meeting that took place in Philadelphia that showed how particularly the Palestinian branch of the Brotherhood in the US decided to create CAIR as a public relations organization. So historically, the founders of CAIR were individuals who were core members of the Brotherhood in the United States. Now that's 25, 30 years ago.
Right.
And if I look at certain branches of CAIR in Nebraska, in Alabama, you know, most people that work for CAIR are not members of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're Muslims, in some cases even non-Muslims, are concerned about civil liberties, are concerned about the Islamophobia that undeniably exists in the US like in any other Western country, and think that CAIR is a good organization. At the same time, if you go to the core leadership of CAIR, you still see some of those very same individuals who have links to the Brotherhood. You still see connections to other Brotherhood entities. You still see some of those financial ties to Turkey, to Qatar. So it's exactly one of those organizations where a moment of honesty on the part of the organization would say, well, we have that history, we acknowledge it, we have evolved, and more openness would lead people to see it as in a different way.
And what about organizations like the Nation of Islam? Since is there? I know that you do have the story of the one member of the Brotherhood who came through the nation to find his way to the Brotherhood. But are there efforts by the Brotherhood to make deeper connections to the Nation of Islam?
So I used a few words that I said are the sort of the name of the game. I said gradualism, I said flexibility. The third one I'm going to use is opportunistic. Mm-hmm. The Brotherhood is extreme. I mean that in a good way. They're political animals, and opportunism is a big part of being a good political animal. So the Brotherhood will work with anybody that they think will help them advance their goals. That means they work. I do talk to a lot of Brotherhood members, and I've spent days with Brotherhood organizations that would have in the morning a meeting with an LBGT organization, and in the afternoon would host a Salafi speaker who says that gays should be killed. That's in the span of a few hours. So that tells you about the very opportunistic nature that they have. So when it comes to even a group like the Nation of Islam, which for the most part internally they don't really see as Muslim, they see it as sort of a weird deviation, sort of a sect, a cult. But at the same time, they acknowledge that it is an important group, and they, for example, called a lot of speakers, a lot of preachers from the group, because there's a tradition of very eloquent speakers that come from the Nation of Islam that are used by the Brotherhood, sort of reconverted to Sunni Islam and used. So there's that kind of approach where they use them, they occasionally flirt with them, but of course they always see them as non-fully Muslims and definitely inferior to them.
There's a question here from David Rosenberg, says that the title of your book evokes the memory of a book with the similar title by David Price Jones about the outlook of the Arab world. And David is curious, and we've been talking about the Muslim Brotherhood as a bureaucratic organization, how it functions. But what about the larger issue of the role of Islamist thought in shaping or misshaping politics and society in the Muslim world, and the way that it influences the way that, the way that Muslims think about their place in the broader the broader world, Muslim and non-Muslim, right? Is Islamism, is the Islamism of the Muslim Brotherhood a limitation or a problem for integrating Muslims into the broader society?
It's a big debate. That's a $1 million question. That is what everybody is debating, and I would say the European debate on some level is a bit more advanced than the American one. From this point of view, is because these organizations, which remain small, the numbers of these organizations are very small, but they have a disproportionate influence because of the funding, because of their activism, and because of the lack of resources of their competitors. They do exercise a disproportionate influence. It doesn't mean they run Muslim communities, but they have this influence. what does that mean if their worldview, if their interpretation of Islam, if their social, political worldview becomes mainstream? Does that lead to integration or not? And there's a big debate, of course, opinions split. I would say I tend to be more on the pessimistic side. If you read the assessments that come from security services of pretty much any European country, you will see extremely negative assessment. The Germans, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Austrians, the French, they're all pretty much making the argument that actually in the long term, the kind of Islamism espoused by the Brotherhood is more problematic than the one of the jihadists. The jihadists are sort of a epiphenomenon, kind of a tip of the iceberg, but they're not going to be a big problem in the long term. The sort of us and them, if not us versus them mindset that the Brotherhood pushes is the one that Europeans are really concerned about. It creates sort of this polarization within society, this narrative of victimhood, this narrative of sort of conspiratorial mindset. It's what really concerns a lot of European countries. And I would say, if you saw the speech that Macron gave just a few weeks ago, gave a landmark speech. It feels like ages ago now. We haven't mentioned COVID in the whole time. It's great. But before all this happened, gave a landmark speech in which basically argued that it's not about terrorism. It's about the lack of adherence to a common society, a common view, that the kind of Islamism that the Brotherhood and Salafists, you put them in the same, but non-violent Islamists push. This is sort of where Europeans are really, especially now that terrorism has declined, this is where continental European countries in particular are really focused on, is the social impact of Islamism, because they think their assessment, not universal, but I would say increasingly common, is that it is detrimental to integration.
And so that's the fear of the parallel societies that the Germans are always talking about, that you create a separate society that refuses to integrate. In your book, you do mention that, for example, the Brotherhood liked Sweden an awful lot as an area to operate in because the Swedes are so multicultural that they were unwilling or unable to criticize the Brotherhood's behavior. Is this, for the long-term relationship of the Brotherhood to the West, is multiculturalism the ally of the Brotherhood because it makes it possible for the Brotherhood to avoid criticism for its separatism from society, because there is no broader sense in the West of a coherent alternative?
Well, it depends on what we mean by multiculturalism. I think, well, what is their biggest ally is an excessive interpretation of multiculturalism. The one that sees Muslims only as Muslims, as sort of a separate tribe that needs to have its own chief, and that the government can only engage Muslims through the lenses of religion. And that is sort of the approach of excessive multiculturalism. But if you take that approach, which to some degree Sweden has adopted, which is to some degree the UK used to adopt, I think things have changed quite a bit in the UK. But it's the idea that these are sort of separate community, they need to retain their identity, everything that is in those communities is okay, and we should accept it. And really those communities need to be governed only by people that come from that community, which would be sort of the gatekeepers to which we governments would rely upon to kind of, it's sort of like almost like transferring the colonial mindset, the way the British used to rule certain parts of the world, kind of transporting it back to the UK or in Sweden or in other countries. Now, of course, that creates an ideal environment for the Brotherhood, because who is better positioned to be that tribal chief, to be the gatekeeper, if not individuals who are better educated, better funded, better organized, know the culture better than anybody else, which are Brotherhood leaders, compared to who their competitors would be. So that kind of setup has been perfect for them to create the system, to be sort of running these parallel communities. Now, if then, like in the case of Sweden, multiculturalism also entails a lot of public money going to a variety of activities. So running schools, running integration activities, and giving that money to those tribal chiefs. Now you see that empowers them even further. The Brotherhood in Sweden is one of the dynamics that I discovered while doing this work, is that they barely did fundraising in the Gulf, because why even bother go do fundraising in Saudi when your biggest source of funding is the Swedish welfare system? They'll be the ones giving you money. So why bother to fly all the way to Kuwait or Qatar? So that vision of that interpretation of multiculturalism, of course, has been very useful to the brothers.
I gotcha. Well, related to this, then we got about 10 minutes to go, so I wanted to just get a couple more questions in here. And one of them is Mike Noonan asks, why are the Gulf monarchies more concerned about the threat of the Brotherhood than about other radical takfiri actors in the Islamic world? Or well, are they more worried about the Brotherhood than those other actors? And if so, why?
Sure. First of all, good to hear from
I thought you'd be pleased to know Mike's out there. He's out there listening. That's right. Another member of the family.
Because they pose a political challenge. Simple as that.
Simple as that.
Simple as that. The other groups, now, of course, they are concerned about the jihadists, but I think they make an assessment which is similar to what other countries would make in the West. It's not going to be the jihadists that will take them down. It's not going to be the terrorist attack, as bad as it is, that will make the Saudi monarchy collapse. They fear political challenges. Salafism, in many of its manifestations, not in its more political sort of Salwa-like manifestation, which is basically a Brotherhood spin-off, is challenging, but non-political, quietist Salafism, even if more extreme in its views, but if not engaged in politics, does not pose a challenge. Therefore, is not much of a concern. And actually, this is what some countries, Saudi in the first place, have been doing over the last few years. Since they stopped funding the Brotherhood, they still do fund Salafist networks, whether at home or in the West. They do see those networks as a challenge to the Brotherhood.
Well, and that relates to the other clutch of questions that I have here from Nelson Wolf and from Raleigh Flynn as well, is what are the prospects for the Brotherhood as a political movement back in the Arab world, right? We saw the brief success, overreach, and then nemesis in Egypt. But what are the chances of the Brotherhood ever accomplishing their goal of political leadership in the Arab world, in the Levant, or in North Africa anytime in the near future?
Sure. I often prefer to speak about brotherhoods.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, of course, all the different branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, from Morocco to Indonesia and everything in between, in every Muslim majority country, you have sort of a Brotherhood spin-off, Brotherhood branch. All of them are part of one big family. They are follow more or less the same ideology with sort of local twists. They have the same methodology, and they interact. They have personal, organizational, financial connections. But at the same time, they're independent. They choose their own tactics. They look at what the other organizations do. They constantly communicate. They coordinate on certain things. But what happens to the Brotherhood in country A doesn't necessarily affect what happens in country B. Of course, when the Brotherhood in Morocco, in Jordan, in Yemen sees that the Brotherhood in Egypt goes to power, that's a boost to morale. That all obviously leads to more timid supporters of the Brotherhood to become emboldened, of course. But at the end of the day, the impact is not that direct, not that immediate. So you have the Brotherhood basically in power in Morocco. They're part of the government, prime ministers, ministers, of course, under the rule of the king. So we're only with some degree of power. But every country follows its own trajectory. That also means that even from an ideological point of view, the different branches of the Brotherhood, yes, they're part of the same family, but if I compare the Brotherhood in Tunisia with the Brotherhood in Yemen, we're talking about two very different animals. The Brotherhood in Yemen is somewhat de facto very similar to Al-Qaeda. The Brotherhood in Tunisia is a group that has unquestionably, over the last 8-9 years, accepted the democratic process, lost elections, did what everybody feared the Islamists were never going to be able to do, which is accept a defeat. And they did.
And so they're still an active player in the political life of Tunisia.
And they are. So it's difficult to say. I think obviously the enthusiasm that existed throughout the region for the Brotherhood kind of Islamism in the first part of the decade that just ended is no longer there. Obviously 2011, 12, 13 were sort of the glory years of the Brotherhood throughout. We're sort of in a different state, but every trajectory in every country is different. Mm-hmm. So,
well, and obviously there's a lot to talk about, and there will be a lot to continue to talk about. But unfortunately, we are about out of time for this conversation. Lorenzo, Vidino, it's been terrific to have you here. Once again, for everybody out there watching, the book is The Closed Circle, the joining and leaving the Muslim Brotherhood in the West. We thank you so much for joining us here tonight, Lorenzo. And we thank everybody for joining us and for your support for FPRI. And I want to turn the microphone back over to the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Raleigh Flynn. Raleigh?
Thanks very much, Lorenzo and Ron. That was a fascinating discussion. Thank you this evening to our audience for tuning in and joining us, and for some really, really great questions. If you enjoy events like this, if you get a lot out of them beyond the glib headlines that you see on television, your support makes events like this possible. So we thank you, and tell your friends. Anyway, have a great evening, and thanks again to Lorenzo and Ron. Good night.
Thank you, Raleigh. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.